Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this online roundtable organized in cooperation with the DGAP in Germany and TEPAV in Turkey. This roundtable is promoted in the context of the Think 7 Italy, which is the official engagement group of the G7, and the Think 7, ISPI is a co-chair of the Think 7. The Think 7 brings together leading think tanks from G7 countries and well beyond, as you will see also today in our roundtable. Today, we place the spotlight on the debt trap. Global debt today exceeds $300 trillion worldwide. So it means that it is about 3 times the annual world GDP. The situation when it comes to the debt is severe for many mature economies, also for G7 countries, including my country, Italy, but it can be dramatically severe for poor and developing countries, especially in a context of high interest rate, which is the context in which we are today. So basically, the 2 main questions that we will now make to our speakers are, first, how to escape the vicious circle of an ever-increasing debt burden, and second, what recipes can be offered by G7 countries and, of course, other countries and other international organizations to escape the fate of a debt trap. Today, I'm very glad to introduce our speakers, who are Franco Bruni. Franco is Vice President of ISPI. Thank you very much, Franco, for being with us. Coskun Cangoz, who is the Center Director of TEPAV. TEPAV is the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey. Thank you very much, Coskun. And then Shahin Vallee, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the DGAP in Berlin. The DGAP is the German Council on Foreign Relations. So, without further ado, Franco, let me start with you. So, the debt trap, increasing debt, there is a huge responsibility on Europe. Of course, Europe itself has a problem of debt, increasing debt. Our country has a real problem with debt. But what can the EU do also to alleviate the debt burden, also for developing and poor countries? Please, Franco.
Well, as you said, a crucial part of what we call the debt trap is the trap of the debt of the less developed, poorer countries. However, part of this trap is embedded in a wider and global trap that involves in the deepest way the advanced part of the world and some of the most industrialized and rich countries. I mean, the debt of the United States is enormous, both the private and the public. During this first quarter of a century, total global debt has been increasing enormously. It's now around 300% of GDP. Only part of this increase is due to deal with the various black swans that contributed to the perma crisis. I mean, the pandemia, etc., and then the wars, etc. But monetary and fiscal policies have been favoring the natural structural incentives that are built in the nature of markets and of operators to overlend and overborrow. And this is mainly due to short-termism. Stopping and curing this phenomenon is very hard, but very urgent. Its importance is directly connected to the dramatic but more specific problem of the debt of the less developed part of the world. The amount of help that advanced countries will be able to offer, also in their own interest, to the poorest one, will obviously be inadequate if they have their own troubles with the debts, as they have been having recently. I am far away from the ideas of degrowth movement. Let's grow less and grow better. But I suspect that when debt grows for too long, too much faster than GDP, then there is something wrong and false also in that GDP growth. So there are many technical remedies to this problem, obviously, including the reduction of tax incentives for indebtedness, which are enormous in nearly all jurisdictions. We can stop with several measures the dramatic decrease in the accumulation of risk capital. I mean, these large firms that make a lot of profits and buy back their own capital are a disaster from this point of view. Performing vast debt equity swaps, also specifically oriented to the less developed countries. We can write rules for government debts, similar to what we do in Europe, but possibly more effective. We can, most of all, we can keep interest rates at a decently high level while avoiding strange bets on the fact that natural rates have been going down. And this is what has caused this enormous amount of liquidity and debt of the last years. We can also de-emphasize in many instances, including bank regulation, etc., the expectations of bailouts, which are an incentive to go into debt. However, the main thing to be done, according to me, and we can come back to the European role maybe later, the main thing to be done is what we argued with Antonio and other authors in several policy briefs that we presented in past editions of the T20, like the one in Argentina, in Japan, and so on. And the main thing is basically to emphasize enormously in controlling and monitoring the global financial situation, debt GDP ratios, setting maximum amounts, trying to monitor this and trying to convince countries to reduce. I'm talking about both private and public debts, because there are countries where public debt is very high, but private debt is less high. I think that debt relief and debt restructuring mechanisms, especially directed towards poorer countries, will greatly benefit from a less indebted advanced world, and we should move in this direction, I think. Thank you.
Franco, in particular, what do you think that European states, also in the context of the G7, should do? Because, of course, these are broad recipes, but we are now very close to the G7 summit in Apulia. What would you expect from this summit to this aim?
Obviously, we have to be generous and open to all sorts of devices that in the short run will be set up for alleviating the problem. But there's something structural, strategic that Europe can do. And basically, this also has a sort of a political condition. Europe should avoid to favor the deep divisions that are now obstructing the progress of multilateral governance of world affairs, the goods and the bads, the West and the rest, and other dividing lines. I mean, this has to be refused by Europe. And probably the better way to do it is to leverage on the potential role of the global South, because in my view, I may be wrong, but global South countries are very different from one another, and the most relevant characteristics they have in common is precisely the desire to avoid being part of one or another bloc. And Europe should leverage on this. And while Europe is certainly part of one bloc now, it has to try to decouple a bit and scatter a bit the different groups of countries in the world, leveraging on its relations with the global South. Now, if this is done, then we can together propose and approve very important changes in the governance of the global multilateral institutions, like changing the votes in the IMF, and Europe could, for instance, join its own votes that now are very abundant, but exercised in a very devised way, get them together, express them in a unified way. And then with these changes in the weight of Europe in the global decisions, we can proceed with reforms. For instance, the reforms that Brookings has been proposing to the governance of the IMF and the World Bank, including the fact of having a less resident type of institution, and therefore involving the IMF and the World Bank, top quality persons of all countries, also the poorest and less involved countries. They can really put in the IMF work their best people, but these people should not live in Washington. I mean, so this is one possibility, and there are several other reforms. Brookings has done a tremendous job in listing them, but in order to make this thing feasible, the powers have to be redistributed a bit, and Europe is in the position of doing the broker of this, because we have the credibility of a Western country. We are solidly allied with the United States, but we can have a strong credibility with the Global South because of our vocation. And I think that also China can have with us an important dialogue.
And Franco, frankly speaking, I mean, Europe has a lot of votes in many of these international institutions, much more than what is, economic weight.
We have to abandon these votes in favor of those that have too little votes compared to to India, for instance, which is really incredible.
Franco, we will go back to this.
Votes, but if we then have votes exercised in a unified way, so votes assigned to the European Union, not to the individual countries, then the trick is done. I mean, we are powerful enough to broker the rest of the world in a way.
We will go back to this, but you mentioned the dividing lines, which are marking today's world. So taking into consideration these dividing lines, now let me turn to Shahin Vallee. Shahin, the world in which we live today is characterized by increasing trade barriers, sanctions, rising protectionism. So what is the impact of all this, of this geopolitical and geoeconomic context specifically on that? Please, over to you.
Well, I think the consequence of a less open economy, more broadly speaking, will be inevitably lower growth. And I think, lower growth in an environment of already high debt levels will mean debt sustainability challenges. And so I think there is a very direct connection between the openness of the economy and debt in that sense. I think there is a second element, which is that, and that echoes the previous speaker's points, which is that we have built and we have lived over the last 70 years or so under the guise of the Bretton Woods institution. And so basically multilateral institutions that were designed both to organize the opening of trade and markets, but also to deal with the consequences of a global economy. And that was the role in particular of the IMF and the World Bank. The danger is that this balkanization that we are seeing on trade is also happening in the international monetary and financial system. And as a result of this balkanization, the ability of the IMF and the World Bank to play their stabilizing role might be undermined. And in substitution for these institutions, competing institutions would emerge And that has been the case in Asia in particular, with the emergence of regional financial safety nets, of the Belt and Road Initiative, of the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, basically institutions that were, either in the beginning established as a complement to address the shortfalls of the IFIs, and there are now increasingly competitors to the Bretton Woods institution. So I think the danger is that this balkanization on trade leads to a balkanization of the international financial and monetary system, that, on top of reducing cross-border trade flows, would reduce cross-border international flows. So I think that the danger is that, and I think that would mean for the financing of debt, a much more challenging environment, because with less international flows, there will be more challenges to finance debt, in particular in developing and emerging countries. Maybe I'll add one element in response or as a follow-up to the last discussion. I think the point that was made about what the G7 could do and the role of Europe in particular in these international finance institutions is very important. And I would really second what has been said earlier and stress that point. We Europeans, keep on talking about defending the multilateral world order. But we could play a very direct role in that. One thing that is undermining confidence of the global South, to call it that, in the multilateral system, is the fact that we keep talking about the defense of the multilateral system, and we keep refusing to share the power in these multilateral institutions. And I think the reform of the IMF quota is a typical example of a bit of schizophrenia on our part. We can't continue to want to uphold the multilateral order and not be willing to accept greater voting shares for India or China in these institutions. And I think what was said earlier is that the best way for us to do that is for European quotas and European representation at the IMF in particular be unified. And I think that would also put us in a much better position to put pressure on the US to do the same, because I think reforms have to come both from the US and from Europe.
Shahin, let me ask you this, because I remember that I made the comments that yourself and Franco Bruni are doing on the reform of international organizations, of the IMF, for instance, to a high representative of the State Department, of the US State Department. And, their point was yes, okay, we would be willing also to do so. But the point is that as soon as these developing countries, the global South, enters and has more power in the international organizations, they will change also the basic principles of them, because they don't want to respect them. Of course, the reference was made particularly to China. I mean, China is not respecting those rules. So by giving more power in those institutions, they will further undermine the institution themselves, because they don't want to respect those rules. So let me ask you, but also to the other two speakers, what is your point on this, U.S. complaint on this, our comments that we all agree upon, I think, on the request, and rightly so, of the Global South countries for the international organizations?
Does the U.S. respect the rules? Right. So, here again, I think we have to be careful of our own schizophrenia. Yes, there is a risk that China and others would either try to change the nature of these institutions and change the rules. But, we're no models here. We are also bending the rules when it suits our interest. And I think that's the case of, very many countries that are present in these institutions. So, I don't think we should assume that by construction, emerging countries will be less respectful of the global order. And what is certain is that if we keep excluding them from the global multilateral system, they will have more and more reasons to basically make their own rules outside of it.
Crystal clear, Shahin. Thank you. So now let me move to Coskun. Coskun, so far we have seen the broader picture, the global debt, what are the holes in the cheese in the international financial architecture. But now let's be more specific about the countries which are suffering the most from this, from the higher interest rates and from the burden of the debt. So in your view, what are the countries which are risking the most? But also to have, to conclude in a more positive note, what are the countries which are surprising to you because they are relatively resilient despite their economic weakness? Please.
Yeah, thank you. So as you mentioned at the beginning, Antonio, and also Franco in his presentation, yes, the global debt level, it's reached up to like $313 trillion, and significant part of is the government debt. So I was just looking at the numbers that I have provided. So overall, the level of government debt globally is like 96.7% of the GDP government debt. And for the emerging markets, it is 69%. But when it comes to advanced economies, mature markets, it is 130% of the GDP. So why I am giving you these numbers? Because it is maybe not only the debt itself. Because why we don't worry too much about the debt of the advanced economies? Because they have assets as well. So there should be a kind of a broader perspective that we need to consider. But if you focus more on the government debt, as you all know, the IMF and the World Bank has this government debt management guidelines, and it clearly describes the objectives of government debt. What it is the raising of required funds with the lowest possible cost over the medium and long term, with a prudent degree of risk. So in that sense, how we are going to assess the performance or the quality of debt management, the performance of the countries when they are managing their fiscal position, their debt, because it is also kind of a duty of the governments from a broader macroeconomic perspective to have a sustainable path for their debt portfolio. So in this regard, if we focus only the level of debt to GDP ratios, probably this will be misleading. And that's why we need to look at the risk structure, risk profile of debt. We need to look at the yields, the cost of funding. And so also we need to look at the sustainability, whether this debt portfolio do not create any harmful effects on the economy itself. So when we come to the emerging markets, you ask me, which countries surprised you, considering their debt level or their economic conditions, because over the last 4 or 5 years, right after the pandemic, COVID, we just observed that we just saw that many countries, they struggled with high deficits. They struggled with the recovery of pandemic, and also because of the increasing interest rates in the advanced countries, they also had to deal with these high interest rates and also high commodity prices. They all had impact on their debt portfolio. So within this capacity, of course, that was a big challenge for debt managers to manage it. But just I want to mention my own country, Turkey, because after the pandemic, Turkey itself, created such a kind of, risk in its own fiscal position, and it reduced the interest rates, and the real interest rates that was huge, even 30-40%, even more in Turkey, and also inflation, it's increased significantly, very quickly in a very short period of time. Budget deficits, it grew rapidly. So during this period of time, the government, the debt managers, they had to manage government debt. And frankly speaking, I'm surprised that they didn't have too big, problems when they were managing the debt. And also remember, we had this even negative international reserves, excluding the swap agreements of the central bank. And so under the circumstances, with the impact of credit downgrades, it was really tough. I mean, so then we saw that Turkey somehow, at least I'm saying somehow, but of course I know how they could manage it, but did not face with any debt payment problems or any funding problems when managing the debt. So another country maybe I should mention here is Indonesia. Yes, they also experienced a lot of issues that I have mentioned before, all the external issues. They were also kind of a problem for Indonesia, and also they could very well manage this process. So they saw some kind of hikes right after the pandemic, and then they recovered very smoothly, and now they are on track, and they are performing even better compared to the pre-pandemic periods. So these are kind of countries maybe I can mention like positively surprised me. But also another country maybe I have to name it's China, because just a couple of years ago, the government debt to GDP ratio that was around 75%. Now it's quite high. It is around 85-86%. And this rapid increase, that also surprised me, because considering the all economic performance and the capacity that China has, and all the lending capacity that we were discussing a couple of minutes ago, both Franco and Shahin mentioned, that surprised me a little bit. Maybe one last country that I can mention, just I don't want to take too much of your time, maybe that can be also Russia. Why I am telling Russia? Because even in the conditions of war, they still have this tight monetary policy, and also quite low budget deficit, and quite low amount of debt. So what is the maybe common points, common issues in these countries? It is the institutional capacity, maybe I have to mention. That really increased their resilience. So of course, the main duty of debt managers to raise required amount of funds to finance the deficit. But also, as long as they have this strong institutional capacity, including the sound legal framework, sound organizations, they have the ability to really overcome any issues, any problems, even unexpected situations such as pandemic or a war. In this regard, just linked to the point that you were asking, what the European countries, what the IMF or the World Bank or other IFIs can do. I always say, as a former debt manager, putting a lot of investment on the institutional capacity, that is the number one point to me. And of course, that is not an isolated thing. It is very much linked to the fiscal performance of the country. In this regard, the capacity of the tax administration, the capacity of the country collecting tax, it is also important. And the link between the fiscal policy and debt management, the link between the debt management and also the monetary policy, they should be very strong, and the coordination level should be at the highest. So these are the maybe points that I can raise here. Thank you.
Thank you, Coskun. It's quite very interesting what you said, because let's put it in perspective, even because, the audience today is the broader audience, not necessarily experts. And putting in perspective, it means that today we are talking about, a global debt which is $300 trillion. Just 10 years ago, this amount was $200 trillion. So in just 10 years, the increase was impressive. But going back to, some years before, we had the great financial crisis. So my question for you, but also for Franco, is maybe we don't see it coming, but are we sure that another financial crisis is not just around the corner? Or simply put, today maybe the situation is so different, and there are some antibodies that we have developed, that we have been developing over the last 15 years, 20 years. So this is not a possible scenario, despite this huge amount of public and private debt. For very briefly, first to you, Coskun, then to Franco.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think maybe we need to live at least for maybe another 10 years or so with this high level of debt. That is what I see, because even, we are expecting to have a kind of, rate cuts from the advanced economies. Still, we also see that, the inflation is a big issue in the emerging countries. That's why maybe some emerging countries, the big ones even, they cannot really accompany the big advanced economies. So as long as they need to fight with inflation, with this, high food prices, commodity prices, energy prices, they will have some problems when they are managing their debt. On top of it, we have this climate change problem issue, which is becoming a more serious problem ahead of all of us. But especially for the global south, I think it is even more important because of the unexpected extreme natural events, like hurricanes, droughts, floods. They will have impact on the agricultural outputs. And again, it will maybe trigger the food prices, the inflation globally. We have these geopolitical problems. We have war, in Middle East. We have war in Russia, Ukraine. So we have these regional tensions still at very high levels. So considering all these issues together, I don't think that we should be too optimistic to see that the global debt levels will decline soon.
Franco, your view on the possibility of having a new financial crisis around the world?
Well, obviously the possibility is always there, and it's frightening. We often talk together, Antonio, and you know that I'm very worried about that. But let me stress another problem, which is overlooked. It's not only a question of financial stability. It's a question of allocation of resources. So several of the debts are risky, but they are also favoring the flow of capital in where it's not optimal. for productivity and welfare of the world. So we have to manage this and see what we can do. For instance, in America, there are an enormous amount of savings are invested in strange instruments and institutions. We put them at a very high risk, and they direct these savings in ways that are certainly not less risky than if you direct them, for instance, in the poorest countries and in a right way, coordinated internationally. In Germany, I mean, think to the risk we are running in financing buildings in Berlin. I mean, this has been and is currently a problem. This presents issues of stability and potential crisis, but it's also the sign that we have not a good strategy to allocate capital around the world. And now the IMF, the multilateral institution, they could do more, but they have to have a strategic attitude, and they don't have, because the board of directors of the IMF is a strange body made of a lot of people that meet continuously. They are low-quality people that live in Washington as functionaries. So we need to have a strategy discussed in a multilateral way by big personalities that are able to do it. Let me end with one other point, going back to Europe. Europe can do a lot also with its own capital market. The European capital market is risky because it's divided. So we have to unify our bank regulations, our capital regulations, have a large market where risks are more shared and more divided. But in order to this, we have to agree. And Germany doesn't agree with France. Italy doesn't agree with Spain. We have to agree and have a common market. And in this market, I think we can flow then a lot of instruments that can direct saving in more productive directions all over the world. I mean, we can invest in a productive and careful way in Africa, in South America, in Asia. And Europe can really become, we are good savers in Europe. Europe can really become a place where you can float a lot of securities to finance in a better way around. But if we are divided, there's no way to do it, because you float a bond issued in Italy. It's a different thing than a bond issued in Germany or in France. We have to have a deep and well managed lake of savings where the world can come and take liquidity and resources for investment.
Franco, and we also need money for our own. I mean, the European green and digital transition. We keep talking about it, but we need money to do so. And we need also, we could better use the savings of the Europeans. If I'm not wrong, they amount to 30 trillion euros, something like this. And every year, 300 billions go abroad. So at least a part of it could be used also to finance, to support our green and digital transition. But it raises another question. Now I would like to move back to Shahin. Shahin, when in Europe we talk about supporting our green transition, our digital transition, it means we don't like to say so, but to subsidize basically also the green technologies and all you need. This is what we are doing in Europe, what the United States are doing. But it creates some problems for poor developing countries, because simply put, they cannot afford this level of subsidies. So of course they try, they have to defend their own economy. They also need to go through this new green path. And this is also an incentive for them to create new debt. And this is totally unfair. So what's your point of view on that?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. Having an industrial policy in Europe that is financed nationally, which is effectively what we are doing now and what we have done in response to the US Inflation Reduction Act will create, even within Europe, I mean, you've mentioned developing countries, but even within Europe, will create countries that can afford to support their industry and their green transition, and countries that cannot. And I think that's a big issue, and that's why I think we've probably in Europe responded a bit precipitously to the IRA, without really thinking that we needed to have a common pool of resources in order to subsidize our green energy transition. I think this is going to be central, or I hope this is going to be central to the next agenda of the European Commission, because I think if we don't have that, first, we will not mobilize enough investments, and if we do, we will mobilize investments in a very uneven fashion across the EU. Essentially, the countries with the biggest industrial sector and the countries with the biggest fiscal resources will be able to transition, and the others would lag behind. And I think that's a good parallel of what could happen at the global level. Essentially, we've been arguing and negotiating over the last few COPs loss and damages, as well as basically repurposing the international financial system in order to help finance transition in the global south. And I mean, maybe this is a bit tough of an assessment, but my feeling is that so far we have failed. And so I think, we owe a much greater solidarity to developing countries in order to help them finance their energy and climate transition. And so far we haven't done a very good job at this.
Thank you very much. So we are running out of time, but I have a final question for Coskun. Coskun, you have a valuable experience in debt management. So particularly when it comes to vulnerable countries, what is your recommendation for them, for the management strategies, debt management strategies of these vulnerable countries?
Well, debt management strategy itself is kind of, backbone of overall debt management. In that sense, as long as they have a sound and practically applicable, debt management strategy, that really helps them a lot, because the annual borrowing plan, overall, all funding operations, they are all directly linked to that management strategy. So what else? It is a standard approach, which is supported by the IFIs, World Bank, and the IMF mainly, but also having this monitoring capacity of the what we say fiscal risks, contingent liabilities, including the debt of non-financial public companies, the financial stability risks coming from the banking sector, financial sector. They also need to be carefully monitored by the debt managers, given that these kind of risks, mainly from the guarantees and other contingent liabilities, may create a lot of big problems, require additional funding needs, and that can create some burden on the debt management portfolio. Also, as I mentioned before, the link between the debt management and fiscal policy is also important. In this regard, improving the tax capacity and the interaction with the tax administration, it is also important when designing the debt management strategy. But also, recently there are some countries in 2022, 2023, they faced with default on debt. And it was mainly because of the weak debt management capacity, but also there are other factors such as the unexpected FX influences of COVID pandemic and higher yield environment. So in this regard, having this capacity to stimulate all the risks, including the operational risks, it is also essential for having a sound debt management strategy when managing your debt. Otherwise, the countries, especially the vulnerable ones, they may face with a situation that they can be unable to pay their debt. So these are the maybe points that I can mention here.
Thank you, Coskun. So we have to close here. Let me just conclude by saying that, I mean, after this 45 minutes we had together, it's clear that, the burden of debt is really huge. And it's quite sad that today in Europe, for instance, but also in the United States, we are going very close to the elections, presidential elections in the US and the European elections in Europe. And, the issue of debt basically is not there in the political debate. Risks are huge, but it's not in the political debate. This is the sad part of it. That's why we keep talking about that among experts, and we'll try to sensibilize also the broader audience on the topic. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot to Franco Bruni, to Coskun Cangoz, and to Shahin Vallee, and thank you all for watching us. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you.
Bye.